This is Sauren Khosla, and for my CS109 project, I analyzed recidivism rates for various races based on a data set provided from Broward County, Florida, looking at violent recidivism. And the purpose of my project was not to, as accurately as possible, indicate whether someone is going to recidivate or not, but rather to look at the differing odds of an algorithm saying that someone is going to recidivate for varying races and looking at the error analysis associated with that to determine whether the data set is biased or whether our algorithmic approaches to determining whether someone will recidivate is biased. So here is the code I used. I begin by first loading in the CSV containing all the data from the defendants, followed by picking the specific columns that I want. Here I include sex, age category, and race, but those are later excluded in my actual calculations. And then I drop the data that either is not necessary or is insufficient for our calculations, followed by placing all of it into an entirely new data frame so that it's much easier to work with as we're calculating our various values. So the first thing I do here is separate my data into training data and testing data using the first 80% and the latter 20%. And then I first run scikit-learn's logistic regression on it and calculate the false positive rate and the false negative rate to see how it compares for African Americans versus Caucasians, and write up the explanation of that very briefly, but is much more detailed in my actual write-up itself. And then I conduct a similar analysis by manually implementing naive Bayes. And so here I'm storing all the values that I need inside some dictionary so that I can later access them and compare people that recidivated versus people that did not end up recidivating. And again, I include some math explanation as to how the naive Bayes algorithm works. And again, I calculate the false positive rate and the false negative rate. And then finally here, I conduct the same analysis using a Bayesian network that I constructed and calculating the proper probability distributions in accordance with the Bayesian network setup that I outline in my write-up. And after storing all those values inside of a dictionary, I then once again calculate the probabilities of each person in the testing data recidivating, and then analyze the race blind algorithm by then taking a look at race itself and then analyzing the false positive rate and the false negative rate. Along similar lines, I conduct slightly similar analysis here when I have the logistic regression model actually train including race, and so I create dummy variables for race so that it's easier to actually account for each of the individual races. And after I do that, I have it train so that it takes into account race and then analyze the false positive rate here and the false negative rate similarly to determine whether or not the algorithm and the approach to determining whether someone will recidivate is indeed racially biased.